Right, good afternoon, Greg, for the latest edition of the Air and Space Power Association. How are you doing?
Hi, Sean. Good to see you.
No, always good. It's been a busy week. There's so much stuff that we can talk about today. Can I just tee us up? President Trump has been talking about an Iron Dome system for America. It's called, I think, the Golden Dome.
Yeah,
I mean, there's such massive capability gaps in this area. I mean, it bridges air and space because
yeah,
obviously it's not just drones coming in or ballistic missiles. There's also, cruise missiles, also ballistic missiles. So it
yeah.
covers all of our landscape here. What's your view? Are we going to get ourselves a golden dome? Can we afford it? Should we be under the American umbrella? Where does it go?
Something is afoot. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I guess Trump Dome was taken. I don't know if there is a Trump Dome out there, but I don't know why he didn't go for that first. I mean, we did write about this not long ago about an integrated air and missile defense, which is the posh term for what we're really talking about here from a pure doctrinal position. And of course, it's all come about pretty much through Israel's experiences with Iran and also rockets coming from Lebanon and Gaza. So, but Iron Dome is actually quite a specific weapon type. It's a rather short range weapon, as you know, for the sort of unguided rocket attack, but very good and quite cost effective at taking out large numbers of these types of missiles. That's not the type of threat that the UK or Russia faces. We face a rather more sophisticated threat, potentially from ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. So the Iron Dome, as it's sold in Israel, is not the answer. But if you're going to use that language, then yes, we probably do need a better missile defence for those types of threats, because the UK hasn't really had one for a long time, as you and I well
It's
know.
interesting. I was because you're absolutely right. I mean, but it isn't just the Israeli experience, isn't it? It's also Russia has been firing
Yeah.
cruise missiles and ballistic missiles into Ukraine. It does seem to be a weapon of choice for the future. And I reflect back when I was going through flying training up at Cranwell, but just down the road at Barkston, there were Bloodhound missile systems. We had
Yeah.
might not have been the greatest, but we did have a missile defense system in place. When
Yeah.
you ask today the grown-ups about this, they say, oh, well, we've still got Findingdales. You go, okay, that can track this stuff.
Yeah.
What are you going to do when it comes in? Well, the Royal Navy's got a little bit of capability.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, these missiles have to go across some of our European partners first. Yes.
Yeah.
But even so, and I think the principle I would take from the Iron Dome system is that each rocket that the Israelis fire, I think, is something like 20 or 30,000 pounds a rocket.
Yeah.
It's far more expensive than the rockets that are being fired at them.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
point is, what price protection? And I
Yeah.
suspect that's going to be a similar argument for what we do in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about protecting civilian population, but critical national infrastructure. We've spent years becoming efficient by building single things, which, funny old thing, make them quite vulnerable. Or let's be honest, single airfields where we put an awful lot of our stuff in one place. So the protection is fundamental if you're going to be able to deter the types of threats that might obviously try and strike back. You're right, the Navy have got the Type 45 destroyer, but they're in very short supply, and the one serviceable one is about to sail southeast, and we might talk about that later. But it's something we need to look at. I think one of the challenges in the UK is we stopped doing it for a long time, partly because we thought the threat had gone. Russia was no longer the threat we thought it was. Turns out that's not true. And so the Bloodhound was really the last of the big missiles. Rapier we had as a stopgap, but that was a short range missile system, really for looking after troops or airfields. We have replaced that to a degree, but in very small numbers, and it has very short range.
So how do we? Because I'm particularly struck in this space that when you use the Israeli example, so when Iran was throwing a load of missiles, ballistic, cruise, and drones at Israel. There were fighter jets, including some from the Royal Air Force, picking up some of the cruise missiles and the drones. But it was really only America that had a capability against the ballistic missiles. And they were using, I think it was the Patriot system. I think there's also the American THAAD system, which is a sort of next generation. But I'm not aware of another system available on the market at the moment. And those systems are about $1 billion a copy. How
Yeah.
on earth would we plug our huge capability gap to defend the UK? Let's face it, we're not a big island, but we've got a lot of infrastructure. How on earth would we afford to do that?
Yeah, and this is the thing that America are probably quite focused on. So although we can joke about Golden Dome or whatever you want to call it, there is a gap in the ability for many countries to defend themselves from that type of threat. We can remember Reagan's Star Wars, where there were going to be attempts to intercept these things in space. Because that's the real challenge here. If you look at a drone or even a cruise missile, at the end of the day, they're a relatively simple thing to shoot down. They're pretty unmaneuverable. They don't go anywhere very quickly. So they as long as you can put enough missiles in the air, that they're relatively vulnerable. A ballistic missile literally goes into space and comes back down again, and comes back vertically at extremely high speed. That is not an easy target to hit, and certainly not if they come in any numbers. And we know that China, for example, have quite a few of those types of capabilities as well. So it is about defending against that threat, and it is not cheap. And I think that's really the question here. What is the threat? Okay, now how do I meet it? And can I meet that in a cost-effective way? Because one of the arguments is, well, it's so difficult to defend against. You've got to strike what's known as the archer, not the arrow. So how do I take out those capabilities at source? Well, they're a long way away, and they're in hardened bunkers or silos. So the problem becomes really quite tricky. And Star Wars tried to find a way around it and couldn't do it.
I remember Reagan in, was it 1983, wasn't it? Only because I was just finishing university as all that was happening. And it all sounded very dramatic. But actually, it became a really difficult nut for them to crack at the time. I always wondered at the time, when it all went quiet, I wonder if the US are still developing something here. Because if they thought they could do it in 1983, technologies marched along so quickly. But going back to how hard it is, archer versus the arrow, I like the analogy as well that I think THAAD is a hitile, not a missile. In other words, it actually physically knocks the missile out of the sky.
Yeah.
And these things are going Mach several. So it's a bit like shooting down a bullet that's in the air, just to give the audience an idea of how difficult. How on earth would you shoot down a bullet? And of course, the missile is traveling probably 2 or 3 times faster than a bullet is. So that is a really tricky nut to crack.
It was the Type 45 marketing hype, wasn't it, that they'd intercept a cricket ball over London? And I don't know if the Ashes was on that week, but it is difficult. I mean, it's interesting you bring up missile and hissile. I'm not sure how many of our listeners, all 3 of them, are understanding that a missile actually does miss. The clue's in the title. It has a warhead that then explodes and goes out to 20, 30 feet and eventually finds its target. So it only has to get within 20, 30 feet. But a hitile can do that by literally hitting the object, and therefore doesn't need to be explosive. It can just be a kinetic strike, because it knocks it, it just disintegrates the thing and knocks it off its course. That is quite a difficult challenge.
Yeah, no, but I'm interested of how we find a cost-effective city. It just feels one of those things that it's probably beyond the UK to develop a national solution to this problem. And therefore, naturally, we would probably want to go into some sort of collaboration to be under the American umbrella. But given the conversation that's happening at the moment, politically, that feels going to be a really difficult one to engage with. Where do you think the answer lies in this?
Yeah, I mean, your question about the umbrella is a good one. I mean, I'm not sure people realise this. I don't think this is classified. I'll give it away. Fylingdales and other sites around the world, some of which are owned by the UK, provide an excellent early warning system for ballistic missile strikes against America from Russia. So if you like, we're providing the warning, but we're just the guy holding the umbrella, but the umbrella doesn't actually work for us. So there's an issue there about how this actually all dovetails in. We have signed up to the NATO arrangement, where we are looking at a collective solution for this as NATO's. And I think ultimately that's got to be A, where the money is, and B, where the incentive has got to come to protect Europe. But wouldn't it be great if we were collaborating with America? But of course, that ship is not necessarily sailed, but it's definitely preparing to sail. So we're all thinking long and hard about that.
It's also, I think, the one other bit of this that I think relates to space as well is that I know under SDI there was all sorts of concerns about weaponizing space, because if you want to provide a shield, some part of that might want to be in space, because you have to slip out of Earth's atmosphere to intercept this stuff, and a lot of the missile systems are somewhat ballistic, when that's why they're called ballistic,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they haven't got any air to, so they're literally off. Look, they're predictable flight paths,
yeah,
and therefore you're suddenly into weaponizing space. And there's all sorts of treaties
yeah.
that govern that, and that really is a very expensive game once you start getting involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, space, let's be honest, has been weaponized, but it's been done in a way that is sort of plausible in its deniability, and that, you know, China or Russia can sidle a satellite up to another satellite and accidentally touch it or explode next to it, and they've done that, or they just send up debris, either by exploding their own system or just firing debris into space, and that debris then causes damage. Because people, again, don't know this, to take out a satellite, you don't need, you know, a giant explosive. You just need to send a nut and bolt through it, you know, at some speed. So yeah, the weaponization of space is effectively here. We just haven't quite gone the whole way with space lasers and all of that nonsense, but you know, it cannot be that far away. But I think you bring up a really important point, that you can't just talk about this defensive capability in isolation, because if you suddenly have a dome that protects you completely 100% from an enemy threat, the threat's then back on the enemy, because now they know that they haven't got a capability, and so it just escalates the whole process, and in some ways makes it more dangerous, not less so. So yeah, this is a real challenge, and I think there's a slight danger at the moment. We're really focused on the drone threat. On my gut feel is we'll solve the drone threat quite quickly. I think just last 2 days, the British Army's announced a sort of high energy system that literally just drops them like flies out of the sky, relatively short range. We are talking now about Dragonfire and lasers. The ECM, electronic countermeasures, is proving effective, which is why they've switched to fiber optics. So the countermeasure game is alive and kicking in the drone world. But the high threat ballistic missile threat, that is a technological leap.
Something slightly more sort of topical, Greg. I mean, you and I have been flying fighter jets at the end of the Cold War. You and I served at that time. I noticed we had 30 fast jet fighter squadrons at that time. We're now down to 9, 7 Typhoon, 2 F-35, and both those F-35s are busy sailing off to the east somewhere at the moment. So not very busy. I do wonder, and there's a lot the SDR is going to be looking at here. If you're looking at point defense of the UK, we're an island nation. You know, you do need to have some credible air defense capability built around fighter jets.
Yeah,
9 squadrons just doesn't feel enough. We can't easily solve that problem in the near term. So in the near term, is there an opportunity to have more Typhoons? Should we buy more F-35s? Again, should we? What are the relative merits of those before we look at the longer term?
Yeah, I mean, I got myself into trouble around this subject in 2010 when I ended up on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, if I remember rightly. When we
Remind me what that was about, because our readers will probably Google it. So what?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still, if you Google me, Belgium still crops up. So I was asked the question, because I just gave the numbers. The SDR had said what the numbers were. I wasn't telling anything out of school. I just gave the number. And a very astute journalist asked me how that compared to Belgium, which apparently is a thing in journalist world. We should always, I don't know if this goes back to Waterloo or what, but comparing ourselves to Belgium is a thing in the journalist world. And I was asked how we compared, and I said, well, I think you'll find we're a little bit bigger than Belgium, and we're not a very Belgium-minded country, which got me in quite a lot of trouble with Belgium. Because the chief at the time in Belgium was a good friend of mine, and he did write me a note saying, what do you mean, Greg? I said, oh, no, I'm really sorry, it just came out. But I got in more trouble with the government of the time, who didn't want servicemen and women complaining about the amazingly strategically brilliant SDR that had just cut us in half. And so, yeah, I was a bit of a scapegoat on that one. But I stand by what I said, because the answer I gave was, is it enough? Or the question was, is it enough? And my answer was, look, I can do the tasks I've got today, but I can't do anything more. And now we've got less than that. So that is the question here, that the numbers, it's very difficult to make a case for what is the right number. 9 doesn't feel like it. 30 probably is way beyond our capability these days, even though you're right, it wasn't that long ago. So it's somewhere north of 9. And at the moment, of course, it's going down to 7. Because 2 of those Typhoon squadrons are the Tranche 1 Typhoons that are quietly being scrapped for spares. And one of those squadrons is a joint squadron with the Qataris, which is just about the only way we can keep these things going these days. So yeah, that number is incredibly small, because when you look at doing QRA, quick readiness alert, in the UK, the Falklands, Baltic policing, or in Poland, and I know you've got some personal involvement there, and it's the numbers go quite quickly. You are fully tasked, and what you're trying to do as well, of course, is still bring in new blood. So you're trying to train new pilots. You're trying to stay trained in the high end sort of capabilities that you need to fight a threat like Russia, which is to go away and do exercises. So you run out of airplanes very, very quickly.
I do wonder, because I think the backdrop to this is, we talked about this before, but in a wars of choice, we were generally fighting in coalitions. We were generally fighting against people, whether it's Kosovo, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan. They didn't really have a credible air power capability or a threat. So we didn't need large numbers. We just went across as an alliance, and we sort of took it in turns with the Americans or whatever. And therefore, you could drop down significantly the number of platforms you have. They get a bit more expensive, but you can manage because you're choosing when to deploy. As soon as you're into this sort of defending our island nation, suddenly quantity has a quality all of its own. And I was particularly struck, before I came on, I thought, okay, Battle of Britain, how many squadrons did we have? And it turned out we had 71 squadrons fighters in the Battle of Britain, and we ran out. And we had 386 squadrons during World War II. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute. Clearly, there are economies of scale here. And I regularly use as a bit of banter that we used to do 1,000-bomber raids with Lancaster bombers carrying 20,000 pounders. Well, the reason we did that was the average miss distance of a bomb was about 4 miles. So we needed 1,000 bombers, each carrying 20 bombs, 20,000. And even then, we couldn't guarantee to hit a target. Whereas even your old Tornado used to be able to get pretty close, with 3 precision-guided munitions.
Extremely close, I think you'll find
these days.
Extremely
so
close.
One aircraft can be so much more effective than 1,000 aircraft. So I get that. But as soon as you're into protecting your island nation, it just feels that we're woefully short. And it's not something that you can quickly address, quickly ramp up the numbers.
Yeah, we've used that argument continually in the time I've served, that no, technology means we're better and therefore we need less. And we've used that every single time. So eventually the Air Force is going to be, I've already said this, it'll be a single red aeroplane of 617 Squadron, doing air displays on weekends. Clearly, quantity has a quality of its own. And there is a minimum number out there. And at the moment, in all departments in defence, not just the Air Force, but let's talk about the Air Force, we are exceedingly thin. 3 E7s, 9 P9s. You can count these on 2 hands, and they're all on one base. So this is a challenge, and in an attritional war, that is a problem. And I think that the problem is, for 20 years, we've been able to fight wars of choice with half a dozen airplanes deployed, maybe 12 maximum. And once you start using 6 as your number, multiples of 6 become the norm, and you can very quickly justify your numbers. And if you're dropping 3 bombs a week on an insurgency, you multiply that by 52, you come up with 150 bombs a year. Well, guess what? We're dropping that a day in Ukraine. Not we, but the Ukrainians. So, there is a different scale here that we have forgotten how to fight against or equip for.
So near term, though, we can't just nip down to the shops and buy F-35s. There is a production line, and we've got to take our place. You mentioned the Typhoons. Obviously, we're not going to the history of it, but for the benefit of you, we invested in Typhoon as an air defence replacement aircraft. Then all of a sudden, the Cold War ended, and we went, we'd like a multi-role aircraft. The coalition of the willing sort of fragmented. We then decided to multi-role. So Tranche 1 came out as air defence missile aircraft. Tranche 2 came out as a sort of with an air-to-ground capability, and Tranche 3 came out as truly multi-role. And so as a result of that, we're sort of quietly hiving off the air defence. But we could, transform the platforms we have and make them more of them air defence, because is the defence of the UK a primary role? But I think part of the nub of this question is we get under the bonnet of it's just a Typhoon. The E-scan radar, it's never it now has, some of them have, they had a manual scan radar. The E-scan radar is the standard now for any military jet. And of course, they cost an absolute fortune to put them onto the Typhoon, and we're therefore not putting many on. Whereas the Joint Strike Fighter comes off the production line with a fantastic E-scan radar. Is Typhoon the answer?
Yeah, so if we assume that our argument prevails and more aeroplanes are required, I'm not sure that's a given yet, but let's assume it is. What would you choose? Would we choose more F-35s or would you choose more Typhoons? Let's just get rid of the economic arguments first, because whether we like it or not, they are there, and we've already seen that. You know, if you're American and you're a Lockheed Martin salesman, you're going to give the answer that the answer is F-35, and for everyone you build, 15% of that money comes back to the UK. I've never seen that proven, but let's just assume that is true. Of course, if you build a Typhoon in the UK, then you get even more money coming in. And the unions, certainly Unite up in Wharton, are making strong overtones saying that, look, it's far better to build Typhoons. It's good for business, but it's also a sovereign capability. It's not, it's European, but it is non-American, and although there is some American stuff in it, but there's that argument about sovereignty. So there is an economic argument to be made, and of course it does bridge to the GCAP argument. We'll put that to one side because that's also a factor out there. So let's just talk about a capability argument. Which aeroplane would you choose to have? F-35 is obviously in a more advanced generation. Its sensors, its stealth capabilities are all better than Typhoon. Has a really poor range, doesn't have a very good weapon fit right now, and the F-35B model is the worst of the bunch. So it's not the greatest. Now, the Navy are going to make a very strong argument, rightly so, about how many they think they need in order to generate carrier strike capability. And the current number that we've paid for, 48, doesn't feel like that's enough. So, you know, you're going to need more of those if you think you want to invest in the carrier debate. But in doing that, we are going to get a slightly inferior model of F-35 that is not going to have as much impact as another model might.
Yeah, because I was, for my sins, I ended up being a requirements manager on the F-35 for a while. So a bit like that Men in Black thing, I've had to look at the flashing light and forget everything that I learned. Yeah. But it is worth, I think it is, again, worth reminding viewers here that, you know, we can badmouth the F-35B because it's only got 450 odd mile range. It's far worse range than the other models. Yeah. But we were a design driver. The UK and the US Marine Corps were drivers for that capability. We wanted to have an aircraft that would be a family of aircraft, and it needs to be able to hover, and the minimum range was 450 miles. That drove the design of that. Now, as soon as you take the lift fan out of that design, it leaves you a whole load more space that you can put more fuel tanks. Yeah. So you then become with the A model, which is the same size, same shape, but without the lift fan, and therefore it now goes 750 odd miles, 800 miles. And if you then try and land that on a carrier, it actually lands too fast. So they had to put bigger wings on the carrier version, the C version, to slow it down before it actually hits the deck. And of course, with bigger wings, you get more fuel tank, and therefore it goes even further. So whilst it is the worst in terms of range, it is the design spec we decided. But of course, it is worth remembering that was decided before Russia invaded Ukraine. It was decided before the whole American thing. And I think today, first of all, I believe that the F-35A, the longer range model, is actually about 30% cheaper than the F-35B because there are a lot more A's running around. There's much more understanding of how reliable it is, how the maintenance regime and stuff like that is. So it would feel that the only reason we would go down a B route is to prime the pump for the carrier. And yet we're then into the carrier debate, which goes, why would we compromise air power operational capability to create one more landing strip for the aircraft to operate from? I don't really quite get it.
It's why this debate becomes so emotional and it gets cited as being inter-service squabbling. I mean, it's not inter-service squabbling. It is a genuine choice between maximum air power, which would be an A or a C model, and more Typhoons, as opposed to a maritime capability, which clearly right now, because there's no cats and traps, has to be the B model. You and I, you know, I think would probably agree, but for the benefit of all the sort of on the fence out there, you know, of course there is an argument that the flexibility of a carrier provides. It is literally just sailing, you know, to go around halfway around the world. But you know and I know that the numbers that we can put on that deck and the length of time we can sustain an operation and the distance that we can operate from away from a high-end threat like China makes it pretty useless. I don't want to use that language because everyone will criticize it, but it's true. It cannot get close enough because of the range of the F-35. Yes, you could use tankers, but the tankers won't survive either. So you've got a real challenge. And the Marine Corps in the States are now beginning to buy more C models than they were planning and are cutting down their B buy because they know they can do the island hopping with the B, but they know that they need the reach of a C to be able to penetrate in close enough and have a long range weapon. And then that's the other challenge for the UK. Our long range weapon at the moment, it's not fitted yet, is the Spear 3, which gives you somewhere around 50 miles. Well, that's still pretty close to the bad guy if you're only 50 miles away. And even if you are stealthy, is that enough? So, yeah, there is a real challenge here over the F-35 choice. For me, Typhoon has a utility. It is not out of date. It still has an incredibly capable platform. The performance is superb. And if you put the right radar in it and give it all the electronics and bells and whistles and fit all the long-range weapons, you can easily cater for the lack of stealth. So, there's quite a difficult conundrum here to square. I mean, it may be there's not enough money for either. So we're debating almost nugatory. And a lot of that money might go towards GCAP and the future. But 7 squadrons, and that is going to be the number next year, feels too small to me if we're going to find ourselves in Ukraine defending the eastern borders of Europe from an increasingly belligerent and aggressive Russia.
Well, that Sky Shield initiative, we haven't really got into. I think that's probably for another time. But when you do the basic numbers on how Europe would do that, because it sounds 120 aircraft will do it, and actually, when you and I, who've actually flown jets, it's all very well saying, but maintaining a combat air patrol of just 2 aircraft some distance away from your base.
Yeah.
Requires a huge logistic challenge. It's a huge undertaking, and that's just 2 aircraft, which quite frankly would be relatively vulnerable. So I do think all of the numbers were done under a very different world when we were projecting power, and as you say, we could just use a handful of aircraft. In this new world narrative, the tip of the sword, and bluntly, if you don't have air power, if you don't have control of the air, life gets incredibly bloody and difficult on the ground, as Ukraine is demonstrating. So it might seem expensive, but my goodness, it's massive value for money if you actually want to preserve life and maintain combat capability.
Yeah, and you're right to point out that number. If I remember rightly, it was about a squadron's worth of aircraft to generate that single combat air patrol of 2 aircraft. Now, if you look at Ukraine, if you wanted to police the eastern borders of Ukraine in a ceasefire arrangement, you could be talking 4 or 5 caps easily over that country, possibly more. And some ground alert too. That gives you your squadron number. In one, that's the whole of the Royal Air Force just to maintain 24-hour watch over one country in a non-fighting scenario. And you need them up there to police it, because actually policing it from the air is the most efficient way to do it, because you can obviously see what's going on and keep an eye on things. So yeah, the numbers aren't just, this is not just about losing squadrons of aeroplanes every week, because we obviously can't rebuild them, not like we used to with Spitfires and Hurricanes, but even in a peacekeeping scenario, the numbers ramp up quite quickly. So that kind of brings us then to the deployment of the UK's Carrier Strike Group. Obviously on the Prince of Wales this time round. It was the Queen Elizabeth the last time, which was in 21, if I remember rightly. Hopefully I've got my numbers right. So once every leap year event. It's in a leap year, is it? But I think that demonstrates just how challenging this is. And one of the key things of this particular deployment is the number of UK-only F-35s that are planned to be embarked. I think everyone's going to be quite coy for the next few weeks. I've got a sneaky feeling the Prime Minister's going on board today to announce something, so I hope that's not the day it breaks down. But it's putting 24 F-35s sounds like a paltry number. Why are we even making a fuss? American carriers will have 60, 70 fast jets on, because that's the scale they operate at. But the truth of it is, we'll be lucky to find 24 serviceable F-35s. So if we do get 24 on, I tell you, the F-35 Lightning Force is going to deserve a big pat on the back, because they will have literally pulled every finger out of every fire possible to do it. Because people talk about numbers. We bought 48. We've lost one, so we're down to 47. We've only had, I think, 35 delivered. 2 or 3 of those are in the States with their trial test wiring, so they aren't going to be used. You've got a conversion unit training new crews to build the force up. They're going to need 7, 8, 9, 10 aeroplanes. You're down at 24. So that's everything.
When you and I were in the fold, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was about half of your fleet were either being serviced, either deep service or repair. So you never had, just because you had 24 Harriers, that didn't mean you had more than 12 available. And even then, they'd be going unserviceable. So 24, which out of 2 squadrons, a Royal Navy squadron and 617 squadron, is I'm struggling to see how, and the full capacity of the carrier is something like 36.
Although they're going to have at least a dozen helicopters on board, so that obviously takes up some of the space. And no doubt, with no solid support ship, some of that Hagger deck might be full of Mars bars and Nutty and cans of Carlsberg, probably. But yeah, I mean, if you remember when we were squadron commanders, you nominally had 12 aircraft. I think we had 12 plus an in-use reserve. I don't think I ever saw that. But 12 aircraft was your theoretical number, and somewhere out there might be 12 airplanes with your squadron badge on the side. On any given day, I mean, I'll give you an example. It was always a squadron commander's ambition to get a Diamond 9 up for a display or whatever. You really had to work hard to get 9 serviceable airplanes in the air for that one fleeting opportunity, and 2 of those would land broken. So, yeah, you're right. The operating fleet is definitely not 100%. It is somewhere around 60, 70% on any given day. They're either in maintenance, scheduled or unscheduled. They're in mod upgrade programs, fatigue programs, and the older they get, the more that becomes required. The F-35 is not known for its serviceability. It's got a lot of things in it that need to work, and if they're not working, there's not a lot of point flying it, so they tend to wait until they fix it. So you might well see serviceability rates down around 60%. That's not unusual. Even 80% would be good.
It's also spares, though, isn't it? We used to, I think we used to call them PEPs, didn't we? From equipment packs. But it was basically saying, you can't take all of your spares with you because you need to leave some back in the UK. As soon as you split your, where do you leave the priority? Do you effectively shut down the training school? Now, as my understanding is, the carrier strike group's going to go on, is it 33,000 miles? It's going to be on a 9-month, and of course, the primary, it's going through, the Suez Canal, Red Sea, through the Middle East and out, eventually the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. And I think part of that, I mean, these things take 2 years to plan, and it's all part of interoperability. I mean, I think there are some really amazing ambitions for this. The trouble is, 2 years ago when they planned it, the world was a very different place. Now you've got America saying, we're going to focus on China. Brits, you focus on Europe. You focus on Ukraine, and I'm not quite sure presentationally, how that fits. Secondly, is you've now taken the whole of our joint strike fighter fleet. We've just talked about how short of fighter jets we are. And now they're going to be padlocked away on a carrier for the next few months. And when I operated off the carrier with the Harrier Force, it was a huge privilege. I mean, it's an amazing capability, but it's very, very limited what actual training you can do for those basic training returns that you and I used to spend our lifetime trying to get, all the various circuits you have to practice, all the various bombing targets, combat, all the various ticks that you have to keep on the board, all the various roles that you have. And that becomes even more difficult, incredibly more difficult when you're on a carrier, because there's large elements of time where you can't actually do anything. So I'm not entirely sure how that's going to enhance our national combat capability.
The problem is whenever you make these arguments, and I agree entirely with everyone you've just made, because actually it isn't just about sitting there and flying off the deck and back again. You've got to do something meaningful with the airplanes. Otherwise you really are just wasting money. It's seen as a Royal Air Force intransigence or reluctance to go to sea. And okay, people didn't join the Air Force to spend months at sea. That although now they're having to because they know what's coming. So I think the attitudes are changing. So I think that argument's a bit old hat. But I don't think people really understand the intricacies of what's required here, because not only are you deploying potentially 24 aeroplanes, That 24 airplanes is 2 squadrons. I can tell you now it won't be. It'll be all 3 squadrons. 207 Squadron, the OCU, will be having to give up specialist people in specialist trades and probably some aeroplanes in order to get to that number. And over the course of this 8 months, there will be people cycling through for all sorts of reasons, illness, compassionate reasons. So the entire Lightning Force is going to be bound up in this 8-month process, because it almost like now we can't be seen to be not having aeroplanes on the deck because it would be embarrassing. Well, okay, but we should actually celebrate the flexibility of being able to go up and down on those numbers. That's the beauty of the capability. Putting 24 on board for 8 months and then taking 24 broken shells off 8 months later, it might look like a success, but it won't be. And after the 21 cruise deployment, shouldn't call them cruises, is that the force took another year to recover from it. Because at the time, it was only 1 squadron's worth. In fact, we had the Marine Corps on board just to make the numbers up.
Well, that was part of the worry, though, Greg. I mean, because having done it, there was this constant debate about trying to demonstrate that the aircraft were part of the ship, and therefore a bit like the American carrier strike group capability. But it is worth remembering they have 11 carrier strike groups. And we've only got a much smaller air force, and therefore we can't afford to have these aircraft permanently attached on the carriers. They have to be available to do their full spectrum roles, and therefore this is more about demonstrating that you can operate off the carrier's deck. And in my humble opinion, when we used to do it, it isn't just about the aircraft, it's about the deck hands, it's about everything else. But within 2 weeks, everybody was humming. It was a well-oiled machine. You did when you were airborne, and frankly, this was simply an exercise in getting airborne and landing appropriately. And that's my worry here, is that they're going to be away for a long time. Yes, they will be enormously influential. I've no doubt they'll do some really good training with Australians, with New Zealand, with all sorts of nations. But will they get 9 months of value, or will those people come back? And we've marked time in terms of the progression of our joint strike fighter capability.
Having done this in the past myself, I know there'll be some difficult conversations between the Navy and the Air Force about what the right size and fit is for the right portions of the exercises involved. And of course, when you're sitting off the South China Sea, you might want to look quite punchy. When you're doing a big exercise in Australia, when, heaven forbid, we're fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea, you need to have the right numbers. When you're doing a NATO exercise in the Mediterranean, I mean, if it was me, I'd be looking to do that 24 as early as possible, ideally within European reach. Do a major exercise, demonstrate what you're capable of, and then get half of them off, and let the rest of them sail, and then peak and trough it as you need to later on, and get it out the way. So you've the genie's out the bottle, you've ticked the box, and then everyone can get back to a manageable, safe setting that is sustainable. Because people don't realize all the spares are going to be on board. There'll hardly be any spares back at home. So actually there'll be a problem now with even flying back at home. And even if you're there, half our weapon stocks are sat now on that ship, sailing around the world, because they've stocked up to full. And that's understandable, because you don't want to be embarrassingly say to the Prime Minister, actually, we can't do that mission, we've left the bombs behind. So you kind of got to take everything with you in case. But the real problem here is not, because it sounds anti-carrier. I'm not anti-carrier. You and I have operated with carriers both in the UK and with the Americans. They are an amazing thing when they're up and running and fully loaded. And with Americans being able to field 2 simultaneously, continuously, 365 days a year, it's a go-to solution. We don't have that. We have
we also don't have all the support.
No.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the astute submarines, it's the destroyers, it's the cruisers, it's the vitriolling, and if you don't have that full spectrum of capability, the danger is you're vulnerable. It isn't just about a floating platform for launching aircraft. It is several billion quid's worth. It's a strategic asset, and therefore it's a valuable target.
You're absolutely right. But the UK's got to be comfortable with the operating model. The French are happy with their one ship that they sail every couple of years, and they make the most out of it. The Italians are not much dissimilar. Spain, perhaps less so. In fact, Italy are doing rather well at the moment because they've gone for a much smaller carrier using the B model. So interesting that they've taken a different approach, which is perhaps more sustainable, but is smaller in size. We've gone for the Big Bang approach, but we can only fire the gun once every 4 years. and you better hope that the gun's ready when you need it, as opposed to being in a fallow year. So yeah, I think ambition has got some people perhaps being a little bit too pushy, and I don't think it's fair to criticise either the Lightning Force or the Air Force for not showing up, as Lord West is often to do in the House of Lords. It is too small to manage. You can get that force on a bus.
Yeah, and as you say, I'm sure we'll return to this because we're diplomatically trying not to examine the whole element of carrier strike. We're looking at the air power element of this,
yeah,
and how we make sure that sword stays sharp and ready to go.
Yeah.
That's the cause of debate. We've obviously got relatively limited time. Can I segue onto one I would like to talk about as well? Is the whole F-16s in Ukraine? There's been a bit of a fanfare. President Zelensky appealed for them. We've been doing training for the pilots. I think nearly 100 have been pledged, but they've only actually delivered a handful so far.
Yeah.
One has been lost to apparently friendly fire over Ukraine. And we heard the other day that back in the 12th of April, Captain Pavlo Ivanov, young 26-year-old pilot, was killed in action as well, these F-16s.
Yeah.
What I'd like to just unpack a bit here is that when the whole story about F-16s was first breaking for Ukraine, I must admit, like I think many of us, went, it's a great idea for when the war is over.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how you're going to convert your MiG-29 pilots to be combat-ready F-16 pilots. They've never operated a Western aeroplane. It's always been Russian.
Yeah.
And there's a different philosophy, different kit, different capability. It's not going to be integrated. They're not going to have much experience. You're going to take them away from the front line, from their MiG-29s before you go back in.
Yeah.
And it always felt like this was being rushed in. Do you think this is actually a wise move, or do you think these losses are just indicative of a desperate political haste to get these modern fighter jets in?
So I'll come clean. I mean, I was a staunch supporter. You don't have to go far back on my Twitter threads to see that, of the F-16 as the option. And the reason I was a supporter of it was there's a number of reasons behind it. If you remember, we were trying to get the MiG-29s at one stage, either from Poland or elsewhere, and that was all being blocked for all sorts of invalid reasons. Let's be honest, but they were made at the time, and we've crossed a lot of red lines since then. So the next question was, well, is even the MiG-29 the right answer? Because it's not the long-term solution. And I think I was certainly thinking longer term, because eventually you want Ukraine to be in a peaceful situation where it's defending its borders again with a beefed up air force from the one it had previously. And if that's part of a European/NATO model, then having an aircraft that easily docks into a NATO structure, whether they end up in NATO or not is a moot point, but would be the right way to go. Plus, we can put our modern weapons on it, modern sensors and systems, and it's got a degree of scalability. And there were plenty of F-16s out there that were becoming available, either from European nations switching to F-35 or in storage in the US or in a variety of other nations around the world. Thousands of the things, certainly hundreds. I was a fan because I think it demonstrated to Ukraine that we had their back, and that it was a genuine commitment beyond just giving them some old MiG-29s. And it was a morale boost, to suddenly see their Air Force fighting hard and being given some of the tools to do it, I think was a positive thing to do. It's been frustratingly slow, which actually probably has helped them, because actually, as you rightly say, you can't just jump in these things and off you go. A lot of people are saying it would take years. I actually was arguing, no, it can take months. If you take a combat-ready pilot, no matter what they're flying, and switch them to an aeroplane like the F-16, you can do that in relatively quick order. Simulators are sophisticated, as long as they're bright enough and they've got the capability, and they probably have, and they've got some English-speaking skills, then off they go. And interestingly, of course, some of that has proven to be the challenge, getting them up to speed on English, fighting in the Western way. But actually, the fact it's taken us so long means they have been able to be measured about this. They haven't rushed at it, because I think my greatest fear is they'd get 2 squadrons and they'd be gone in a week, because they'd charge the Russians and lose them all in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, but I do wonder that there is a little bit about, I was less enthusiastic about this. And I think mainly because they And it was reinforced when I went out there, only 5 weeks ago, and went to one of the bases operating fencer. We're used to an environment where we're used to operating aircraft. We're used to them being modified along the way. We have an air warfare center that can squirt new software in when we need. And actually, when there's a new threat, we've got a bunch of experts, because it isn't just about run away bravely. Part of it is about electronic warfare, being able to squirt wiggly amps at the enemy. Another thing is about putting chaff and flare out. But actually, it's doing it in a sequence that can work properly. And then the next one is, of course, you maneuver your aircraft in various planes to try to deceive. All of those have to be done together. And we work very closely with the Air Warfare Center and other. The Ukrainian model hasn't got any of that. Experience suggests that they don't have any real capability against the Russian fighters at all. And I suspect they don't have the support. They don't have the support of the generals, who seem to be a lot more detached. Your air base is your airbase, you've got what you've got, now crack on. And that's not the philosophy of the way we work. And I do wonder whether, even those F-16s, they're 1991, I think, was the most recent model of F-16 that came out. Yes, they probably got a couple of upgrades in them, but they're still pretty old aircraft against a state-of-the-art Russian Air Force.
Yeah, no, all those points are valid. I mean, we don't know the truth, so we are not giving any secrets away. But I am certain there will be assistance coming back from ex-F-16 users in tactics, in how to tweak the aeroplane, how to get the maximum from it. So the fact they don't have that depth of advice is they should be getting it from elsewhere. So that's one thing that's there. We would have had less of that for the MiG-29. The big thing as well is the MiG-29, particularly the ones that Ukraine owned, and on all the other Ukraine aircraft, were designed primarily to fight the West. So they don't have good counters against Russian systems. So actually, the fact that we've now given them airplanes that have counters to Russian systems is a good thing. And of course, it's going to create a challenge for Russia, because they would have known how the Ukrainian Air Force worked, because they worked with them for years. So giving them a completely new platform suddenly gives a whole new challenge to Russia, who, you and I can sit here and probably do a cold hard analysis and probably say, actually, it'll be even Stevens. But I bet you a relatively inexperienced, relatively poorly trained Russian pilot, which most of them are, they'll be quite nervous about this F-16 sitting there with this young Ukrainian gun who sends nice videos on Twitter occasionally showing off about what they can do. So, and as you know, that a lot of air fighting is about bravado and courage and a bit of fighting spirit. So I think it will be causing Russia a bit of thinking, actually, and they'll be quite nervous about what goes on. And when those
the other bit of it, which I thought was interesting, though, was so I visited another base where they were operating the F-16s, but I didn't speak to the 16 pilots. I spoke to the MiG-29 guys, and they were very disparaging about the F-16. Yeah. Now, at first, I thought it was just like you and I bantering about how useless the Tornado is compared to the mighty Harrier. Yeah. But in fact, it was things like that I'd never really thought of. The F-16, because it's a modern Western fighter jet, has a big air intake underneath the nose, doesn't it? Yep. So it's like a Hoover, and it hoovers up foreign objects and stuff off the ground. So if you operate it, you have to keep your operating surfaces clean. Yep. Ukraine is not used remotely to having clean operating surfaces. Most of them are falling apart. Yep. So the F-16s apparently are going around regularly hoovering up rocks, spitting them out of the back. Yeah. And they're sort of going, what's the point in that? It's great for air shows, but no good for war.
Well, there's some truth in that. And yes, you do have to look after them a little bit. They're a bit lower to the ground. And as you say, the intake's underneath. But an F-16 comes with a diagnostic kit and a toolkit. And MiG-29 comes with a hammer. And second line servicing is a boat with a really, really big hammer, because they're built like tractors. And yes, that it's fair enough. That's how they've designed, and it's how they function. But they ain't doing quite so well in combat, it would appear.
It's also, I think, the thing that worried me a little bit talking to them was that first one, it apparently shot down by friendly forces. Integrate air defenses, getting sure that if you're operating in a region where if it flies, it dies because it's Russian and you're a Ukrainian. As soon as you now put any Ukrainian aircraft into that space, really dangerous. You and I, when we in the Gulf War. I know our pilots were more worried about the American Patriot system coming, shooting you down on the way home than you were about the Iraqi systems shooting you down. There is a a real challenge to integrating your air defences to stop your own people shooting you down. And it appears that because this was brand new, the big focus on the F-16 boys, did they actually get the training around the whole package to make sure they protect it? It appears not.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on battle space management. I mean, because you can do it in a number of ways. You can totally integrate it where everyone's data linked and everyone knows where everyone else is. And therefore you've got mode 4 IFF and a variety of different ways of telling good from bad. But that's highly sophisticated, and it's certainly not what's in place in Ukraine. Or you literally package up the airspace and say, right, that's yours, this is mine, don't cross the line. And you can do it rather simply. Now, I don't know the circumstances of that particular incident as to how that was done and who made the mistake. But, you know, you can imagine if you're on the ground in Ukraine, having intercepted a dozen drones a night for the last 3 years, you're pretty trigger happy because that's what you've been doing. If someone suddenly introduces a clever little aeroplane up there who might shoot down 1 or 2, you've really got to ask yourself whether it's worth having that there for the restrictions that then places on the people with the guns on the ground. So yeah, managing air defense networks and integrating ground-based and air-based air defense systems is a minefield. Well, the Americans shot down one of their F-18s in the Gulf the other week. And you're right, we've had shoot downs with the UK and America in the past. So mistakes are made even when the high tech is operating in theory fully functioning. So yeah, you have to find a way to do this safely, and it is a challenge. And it isn't just about learning how to fly your airplane. It's learning about how to fight your airplane and integrate it with all the other users and identify friend from foe. That's why fighter pilots are so clever, Sean, and so carefully selected.
What a lovely way to end. And I would also add that in the comments for viewers, if you want to get involved in this, write your question in the comment section. We'll do what we can to address them in subsequent weeks. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. All the best.